Welcome to Macro Minds, where I talk to economists and other experts about the issues of our time. Welcome to Macro Minds, episode 7, Going for Growth in the Age of Uncertainty. I'm your host, Kallum Pickering, Peel Hunt Chief Economist, and today I'm joined by my friend Douglas McNeill, who I met a few years ago when he was working for soon-to-be Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, and then Douglas was the Prime Minister's special advisor during his time in Downing Street. But that's only the last phase of your long career in politics. So, Douglas, perhaps there's a bit of an introduction. Can you tell us a little bit about your CV?
Yeah, so as you say, Kallum, I worked for Rishi Sunak during his time as Prime Minister, Chief Economic Advisor to him in number 10, and prior to that, similar position throughout his Chancellorship. And before that, I worked in number 10 in similar positions for Boris Johnson and Theresa May. And before all that, I worked in the city. I spent about 20 years in banking, started out at Barclays, and before my time in government, I was at Macquarie, mostly in equity research. And while I was in government, my work spanned, I think, three main areas. One was fiscal policy, ranging from the big first-order decisions about the balance between tax and spend and borrowing, and then leading on to more granular decisions about particular taxes. Then there was the financial system in all its guises, all its shapes and sizes, so ranging from the big banks and the big insurers, regulation of them, health of them, down to supply of capital to small and medium-sized enterprises and access to cash points and that sort of thing, and encompassing a few corporate special situations as well, companies looking to the government for financial support for one reason or another. And then I did quite a bit of work on the international side as well, so interactions with other governments, often in the form of trade negotiations, and interactions with the G20, the IMF, organisations like that. So it was a wide-ranging portfolio. There was a lot to stay on top of, and we certainly had our fair share of difficult periods along the way. But on the whole, it was a tremendous experience. I was privileged to get involved in some really interesting things, and I would certainly recommend to anyone out there in the private sector, whoever gets the chance to spend a period in public service, I would very much recommend that.
So perhaps actually, just in case anyone needs reminding, just let us know some of the things that actually happened while you were in office. So we can start with, how do we put it? It's been a weird 10 years in the UK. So let's go through and name those things. So the first one would be, of course, be the Brexit vote in 2016, but then afterwards...
That's right, yes. So I first went to work for Theresa May in autumn 2016, not long after she had become Prime Minister. And as you say, the Brexit referendum had occurred, and we were into the hard yards of executing Brexit. Then other events followed. So I think of it sometimes in two phases. Up to about 2019, 2020, it was a period of relative stability, funnily enough, looking back. The Brexit negotiation was there, of course, and that took up a lot of airtime and headspace. But on the whole, it felt like we were relatively in control of things. We were making some good progress. In 2019, for example, we registered GDP growth of about 1.5%, a little bit over, I think. So that capped a 5-year period in which GDP had increased by about 10%. Real household disposable incomes had risen by something close to that, despite cycling against some population growth. And the deficit was down to about £50 billion. So it was a level at which the debt to GDP ratio had started to fall. And then in the early part of 2020, things changed. COVID came along and tipped us into crisis management mode. And as soon as that was finished, or before it was finished, the Russian invasion of Ukraine had taken place, and that led to all kinds of convulsions in the energy market and the cost of living and so on. So that second period after 2020 was much more characterised by crisis management, really.
So I want to get onto the question around UK growth and what we might be able to improve our long-run growth prospects. But when you look back over this 10-year period of very unusual shocks and political developments, my impression is actually that the thing that stands out is the resilience of the economy and actually the political system to manage all of this. I mean, and the point that I'm leading up to is we're in a world where I think the general impression is UK politics, the institution doesn't work all that well, and economic growth might reasonably be as flat as far as the eye can see. That's not my view, but of course you have a much better vantage point than me. Would you agree that when we form expectations about the future and make this assessment of government, it's all too easy to forget the problems that we've actually processed? So, what kind of marks would you give the institution of politics, not the politicians themselves, or perhaps the policies, and also the economy, how it's withstood the shocks?
Yes, I think it's true that we have been pretty resilient these past 10 years or more, despite all the challenges that have been thrown at us. We've managed to get through, for example, without a significant recession. The labour market has remained in pretty good balance throughout. Unemployment has never risen to concerning levels. I'm old enough to remember the 1980s, for example, early 1990s, when unemployment was a serious problem. The mortgage market was under a lot of stress. People were struggling to keep up with mortgages. There were repossessions of housing. Negative equity was a huge thing. And we haven't had any of that in recent years, which I think in part is testament to some of the macroprudential regulation that was put in place after the global financial crisis. So at the start of the COVID episode, for example, we were somewhat worried about financial stability. The prospect that the banking system might start to have problems with non-performing loans and people missing mortgage payments and so on. And in the end, we were able to avoid all of that. So I think that is pretty positive. And I think as well, we need to always look more widely. It's always tempting to focus on your own country and its own travails. And of course, the media is set up to amplify that a little bit. Reasonably enough, the media tends to focus very much on things that are going wrong, the few big things that are going wrong, rather than the millions of little things that are going well every day. But if you look around the world, you certainly see that there are other countries with their fair share of political and institutional and economic challenges as well. And so I don't think we are alone in having endured rocky times in the recent past, but I think we have overcome them in a reasonably orderly fashion.
Yeah, so I want to introduce a strange word into this conversation: normal. Let's imagine for a second that the external economic environment settles down, and we see businesses and consumers gradually rebuild confidence. What do you think is a normal growth rate for the UK economy? All else equal, let's imagine we don't see any further policy changes. As of today, the world returns to normal. What's the annual growth rate for the UK, do you think, roughly speaking?
Well, I think in answering that question, you have to think a little bit about the big picture, both historically and internationally. And I think not necessarily refer to the nice decade, as Mervyn King used to call it, or the nice half century, I think one might almost call it, after the Second World War. That was a period characterised by tremendous growth. On average, there was quite a lot of volatility around, more than we've had in the past 10 or 20 years. But nevertheless, over time, output grew a great deal, real incomes grew a great deal, and policymakers felt able to set quite high aspirations for growth. And by and large, they delivered. Now, I think that was a period characterised by productivity growth, for example, of around 2.5% over that post-war half century. And so that's in some ways the historical norm to which I think people naturally hark back. But if you look at the century before the Second World War, the productivity picture was less good. You had output growing by about 1% a year, whether you're looking at the per hour or the per worker measure. And of course, you have to take stats from that period with a certain amount of salt, a certain pinch of salt. But nevertheless, that was the norm as best we can tell. So I think when you think about the historic norm here, it's not obvious to me that the post-war half century is the correct comparison.
It's interesting, isn't it? Just sorry, how the framing matters there, because if you ask most people about Britain in the 19th century, it's considered a great century, failing to recognise the fact that normal economic growth was in the mid-ones, and actually for a long period we didn't get much economic growth. That abnormal post-war period, when lots of positive trends overlapped, produced this abnormally high period of economic growth. But the Bank of England's forecast yesterday in the updated numbers, not this year, which is quite pessimistic still, but further out, the bank has growth at around 1.5%, which is roughly where the OBR has it. Do you think that's a reasonable expectation in this world?
I think it's hard to be more optimistic than that. And one reason I say that is because I think that global demographics are a really important piece of the jigsaw here. And that's another point of distinction with the post-war period, for example, where we had tremendous growth in populations. If you look around the world now, you have populations that are aging, and that's talked about a lot, but they are also shrinking in many key economies. And that, I think, is something that we perhaps don't give enough attention to. So if you look at China, for example, the population of China has now peaked and is now declining at a rate of something like 10,000 people per day on average. Now, I know that China is a big place, but that doesn't seem like a trivial number to me. No. And, if you looked at Japan, it's about 2,500 people per day. Italy, Germany, it's several hundred people per day. Now, I think that's got to be bad for demand. If there are fewer people, then that is going to be bad for demand. So if you are a British exporter, for example, who exports to Japan, well, your requirement for new capital kit, your need to invest, is probably going to be a bit less than it used to be, for example, simply because you're probably going to shift less units. And so I think that is a big headwind to growth of the sort that we used to be used to. And that's why something like the bank's 1.5% looks fairly realistic to me.
And do you... When you think about the outlook for growth and the government's proposal, we're going for growth, and there are various initiatives: deregulation, speeding up planning approval, potentially accelerating energy investment. So an announcement this week around nuclear. If we make progress across these three areas, is it reasonable to expect a bit more growth than that?
Well, the dilemma of the policymaker is that you never quite know which of these things is going to make the difference. It's pretty hard to tell ex ante. I think these are all sensible moves, and I'm supportive of all of them. But one issue that we have to have some regard to, I think, is that this is already a country with relatively fully employed resources, certainly in the labour market, for example. Unemployment low, okay, participation rates have come off a little bit, so there might be scope to get those back up again. But nevertheless, I don't think there's a huge amount of unused real resource to be tapped into. And so in order to shift some of our resources from current employment into new avenues to investment, we're going to have to make quite a bit of an effort, and that could take various forms, some of which would represent trade-offs in fields such as consumer prices, for example. So if we want to invest more, we probably need to consume less, and one channel through which that could be governed is upward pressure on the consumer price level. Now, in the long run, that might be a good thing. But it's nevertheless an issue to which I think we should have some regard. Or if we manage to bring in a lot of a lot of foreign capital, attract foreign capital. You can imagine that putting a bit of upward pressure on the exchange rate, and through that redressing the trade balance, so that we have more resources retained at home for those investment purposes. So I think those are some of the constraints that we need to think about a little bit. Economists can do a job here in just signalling to people that these trade-offs exist, because supply-side investment, of course, is very important, but in an economy where resources are already fairly fully employed, it's not always the easiest thing to accomplish.
That's right. We've discussed this in the past, actually. This balance of savings and investment. Do you think it's right to say that potentially, if you want to raise investment in the long run to raise productivity and growth, actually it may actually come at the cost today of a little less growth? Is that part of this trade-off?
I think it could be, yes, exactly. Growth comes in the long run, of course, but the action that you have to take in the short run can involve moving away from consumption, and that's not something that has had much place in the political discourse, the economic discourse. I think this balance between consumption and investment, and we might have to confront that a little bit more going forward.
Where does AI come into this? I mean, I speak to a lot of American investors, and the one thing that they point out is, of course, we're hugely excited about AI because it's for the first time a technology that is not just a complement to services labor, but a substitute, so you can get genuine capital deepening in the same way you can in manufacturing industry, which I think is interesting. But also that it's not just a software and technology cycle. It's an industrial cycle. It's very energy heavy, energy hungry, uses a lot of water. Certainly the data centers used to cool. You have to build those data centers. And so that AI long run objective involves lots of intermediate steps around energy and water and planning. And so do you subscribe to the view actually that AI potentially resolves many of these productivity and growth problems? Are we taking the right steps to potentially open ourselves up to that upside risk? And perhaps the observation I would make is that it's hard to be worried about weak economic growth because of labor shortages and mass unemployment from AI at the same time. This is kind of two problems, hopefully, that will complement each other, and we don't solve either. We don't suffer either. But tell me what you think about that.
Well, I think it is becoming clear that as you say, the water and energy requirements of these data centers is quite extraordinary. And they certainly take up a lot of space as well. Never mind the water and the energy, they just take up a lot of space. And that's not something we're overly blessed with in the United Kingdom. We're a relatively densely populated island, and the bits that aren't densely populated are pretty hilly. So they're not natural territory for data centers. I do worry a little bit that when you look at some other countries, and the US is a great case in point. They have big areas, particularly in the southwestern United States, where there's loads of solar energy and there's loads of space, and they can build these huge data centers in a way that will be difficult for us to replicate. I think more broadly, though, AI clearly is a big opportunity. It's an opportunity for us to compensate, us and other Western countries, to compensate for the fact that our wage levels are relatively high by world standards. If we can make the people who are earning those wages that much more productive, then that will be a big boost in terms of global competition. I think as well, though, you've got to think of AI in terms of organizational challenges as well, and perhaps this leads back to the labour market and the regulation and politics of the labour market. My point here being that AI on its own doesn't accomplish anything. It only is useful if companies can incorporate it into their operations, and that means changing the way they do business. It means restructuring, changing reporting lines, potentially laying off some people, in short, a certain amount of change and with it disruption. And companies will only be able to do that if they have enough political cover, I think, from the government of the day. Governments may need to tolerate and to some extent be comfortable with a certain amount of disruption in the labour market. So I think that is one of the big challenges to unlocking AI. It's partly about real resources, as you say, the water and the energy and so on, but it's partly about society getting comfortable with a certain amount of change in the labour market, which for some people could be painful.
We seem to be building in the UK out a political consensus that the regulatory environment could be lightened. Perhaps we've been a little bit too risk averse with our setting of regulation after the global financial crisis, and we can be a bit less prohibitive, a little bit more enthusiastic about taking on risk. The consensus is formed around the need to both raise the supply for security reasons as much as anything in an uncertain world, but also reduce the price of energy. I don't get the impression yet that we have a strong consensus around being prepared and ready to tolerate, say, the frictional unemployment that may come as a result of artificial intelligence. Because the more rapid that change happens, the more you have these disruptions. And you make a point about the changing of the capital stock. Again, I think this is a point which is completely overlooked. I mean, a good example of a shift in the capital stock is we got rid of the typewriters and we introduced the personal computer. Or, and this is my great historical fact, factories used to be tall and thin because they were driven by pulleys, and the act of gravity weighs on the pulleys and makes the machines more inefficient. And as soon as we electrify our factories, we don't have tall, thin factories anymore. We have sprawling factories because this gravitational effect on the pulley is not quite, well, it's irrelevant. And so, we try and anticipate what AI may bring, but actually, if it's such a fundamental primary technology, that's impossible. And so there's a faith in the process that has to take place. And it would have certainly been much easier if we would have had 10 or 15 years of good economic growth behind us and we were feeling confident about the future to embrace some of these changes. So I think there's interesting politics around that. I suppose this potentially leads us to a slightly different direction on geopolitics, but I wanted to see if you had any initial thoughts on the news that potentially China has innovated AI in such a way that it's less capital intensive, potentially less energy intensive. The market initially reacted by downgrading expectations for capex, but the Jevons paradox in economics is actually now demand for this stuff. So are we potentially on the cusp of a greater proliferation of AI at a greater speed, or do you think we're being a little hopeful at this stage?
Well, I think this is a fascinating development, this Chinese advanced DeepSeek. That's really taken the whole world by surprise, and certainly the equity market doesn't quite know what to make of it. And I think it's surprising because in many ways it runs counter to the vision of the world that has been espoused by US policymakers for the past few years, which has been all about a range of trade barriers, dating back well before this second Trump administration, a range of barriers designed to maintain US preeminence in AI and the world of chips more generally, to make sure that the US wins the chip wars, as to use the title of one significant book on the subject. And I always thought that was quite a tall order. I think that maybe that sort of thing was possible in the 1960s when NASA controlled accounted for an enormous amount of the world's technological advances. But things have changed since then. NASA's still around, of course, but you've got this whole world in which financial institutions are more important in controlling this stuff, academic institutions, and so on. So there's a much greater dispersal. It's much less easy to kind of corral technological advances within a particular institution or indeed a particular country.
And there's a real enthusiasm for open source as well in the tech community, which is, this is a real innovation. This is counter to what businesses who have been so desperate to protect IP would typically argue. But the tech guys and the coders say, no, let's go open source. Let's all work on these problems together. This collegiate effect seems to overcome some of these geopolitical dislocations.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Exactly. So in the days of the Cold War, for example, communications were much tougher. No email, no mobile phones, and all the rest of it. So communications across borders were much less developed, and indeed to even try and communicate across some of those borders was just something that people wouldn't have done. The people wouldn't have communicated or tried to collaborate with the Soviet Union, for example. Whereas now, both of those constraints have fallen away. And so it looks as though China, to come back to your previous question, is doing a pretty good job of gaining access to the materials and the expertise that it needs to, I don't know if match is the right word, match US and European progress, but it looks pretty much like it, doesn't it? Keep up with it, and maybe, who knows, in the near future to set the pace.
But even to get close in a less resource intensive way and in a way that involves less costs is in itself quite an achievement. If indeed it's true.
Yeah. Well, exactly. Yeah. The prospect of doing all this stuff at less cost is a very attractive one, very positive one for the economy as a whole. It'll be better if the benefits and the profits are spread more widely. I would have thought that's how you get competitive tension and innovation and so on. So I think this does feel like quite a significant moment. And
when we think about geopolitics, I mean, the real issue of the day from an economics perspective is, of course, the new administration in the US under Donald Trump and their trade policy. It's of course early days. The situation is in flux, but it feels different in a number of ways to 2018. But what are your first impressions of, and how might we be thinking about this?
Well, clearly there's a lot to take on board here, and the Trump administration looks as though it is going to use trade barriers, trade weapons pretty actively, and that has various drawbacks with which we're all familiar. I am hopeful that the consequences will not be as profound as all that. I think there are some sort of self-regulating mechanisms here. For one thing, trade patterns tend to be very persistent in my experience. I liked your example of the tall, thin factories a moment ago. So my trade policy equivalent of that is the French wine and champagne business in 1919, when the US embraced protectionism. So that was a trade barrier of a sort, a very high trade barrier. And at that point, the French wine and champagne business, which had grown very reliant on the US export market, was in a lot of trouble. Happily, however, they found that demand for the products from Canada rose at about that time by just about enough to compensate for the dramatic decline in exports to the US. And so I think that is always quite a useful vignette to think about in trade policy. If you're a company, if you have a supplier relationship that you're happy with, then in most sectors, it's going to take quite a bit to disrupt that relationship. If you like the quality of the product and the people you deal with and so on, then it will take a lot for you to sever that relationship. Of course, if tariffs come in or other trade measures, then maintaining that relationship can be more expensive, and that expense has got to fall somewhere, and that may cause pain and disadvantage for some people. But nevertheless, I think that broadly speaking, the trade patterns will be fairly persistent. And then the other self-regulating mechanism, if you like, here is that I don't think the US will wish to push things too far because it needs to have an eye on China as a geopolitical competitor, and it needs to make sure that it doesn't push other parts of the world. I'm thinking particularly of the EU, towards China. We have a situation at the moment where China is able to position itself as the defender of the WTO and the rules-based order and stability in general. And that is going to be attractive to many countries which depend on that rule-based order and like the stability that goes with it. And I think that the US will be smart enough not to build up China's claims to global leadership, or allow it to build up its claims to global leadership too much by pushing things too far on the trade war front.
And where does the UK sit in this? I mean, and again, it's still very early days in this story, but we've heard from Mr. Trump that the UK might be off the hook, as he puts it. But I suppose my gut sense is that, given that Donald Trump was so in favour of Brexit for whatever reason, and at least based on the criteria that he seems to set, which is trade deficits, whether or not European countries pay their way in NATO, whether you're a geopolitical rival in the case of China, the UK doesn't fit any of these criteria. And so it's hard to see what the justification is based on the criteria that Donald Trump has set, but also just on this Brexit point, why, with no obvious advantage in doing so, reunite the UK and the EU in a trade war against the US? My hunch is we might sort of get a trade deal through the back door with the US if the relative price of our exports to the US don't go up as the US imposes trade tariffs on China and potentially the EU. Now, of course, the net effect of trade wars are, of course, bad for the UK because we're so globally exposed. But it's very interesting how the UK fits into this story as a relatively small economy versus the big US and the big EU. Mm.
Yes, I think you could well be right that we occupy a sort of sweet spot here. President Trump seems to have a reasonably affectionate view of the United Kingdom, one might almost say. He is part Scottish by parentage, let's not forget. Our Prime Minister seems to have struck up a decent relationship with him, dating back to before the election. And since we are no longer part of the EU, we are not part of that large target, and perhaps therefore we don't catch the eye or feature in the eye line quite as much as we used to. So I think there are some reasons to think that we might be able to just keep our heads down a little bit and stay out of trouble. One thing that I think militates against that is a specific thing, which is the digital services tax, so-called, which we introduced in 2020. Which imposes a tax on the UK-derived advertising revenues of a few large tech companies, which are mostly US. And the Americans, therefore, regarded the introduction of that tax as tantamount to a tariff on American companies. 2020, when we introduced it, was towards the end of the previous Trump administration, and it went some considerable way down the road to imposing retaliatory tariffs. The US Trade Representative had been through some of the preliminary hoops, quite a few of the preliminary hoops, and gone as far as publishing a list of the exports, the sectors that in relation to which it might introduce tariffs. The Biden administration took a more benign view, particularly because it saw the opportunity of folding the DST into the global OECD-led efforts to reform corporate taxation. Now, the Trump administration doesn't intend to participate in those OECD-led efforts anymore. It looks, therefore, as if they may founder and will be left with the digital services tax standing alone, or indeed standing together with similar taxes in a few other European countries. France has one, Italy, Spain as well, I think. So I can imagine this becoming a bone of contention at some point. The big US tech companies are paying a fair amount of money under this tax. It raises about £1 billion, $750 million, getting on for $1 billion in the UK. So it's not something that the government can easily drop. And indeed, it was quite popular when we introduced it. People think that some of these companies, they have the impression that they don't pay enough tax and that they ought to pay more. So removing it would be difficult for the Exchequer, politically awkward, and yet you can well imagine the US government coming back to it, as it did in 2020, reviving those efforts from 2020. So that is one specific area where I can imagine all our good relations with the US might not prevent a problem arising.
Facing in the other direction before we close the UK and the EU relationship, so our Labour government hoping in some way to try and push for initiatives to reduce trade frictions between the UK and its biggest market, the EU. Businesses would welcome that initiative. Where I feared the UK may have a problem, which I'm less concerned about, and tell me what you think about this, is one worry that the EU expressed throughout the whole Brexit negotiations was that there would be significant regulatory divergence between the UK and the EU, certainly cutting regulation on the UK side, with, of course, the kind of extreme image of a kind of Singapore on Thames, but that would cause problems in negotiating trade deals to remove the direct and indirect, the tariff and non-tariff barriers between UK and EU trade. But now actually there seems to be consensus in the UK and in Europe with the Draghi report that the regulatory environment is probably it's grown too large. It's been overcooked both here and then on the continent. And so there's a scope here. I don't think there's so much trade-off between the UK potentially getting closer to the EU and lightening its own regulations at home. Potentially these things actually go hand in hand, because the complication of the negotiation is, well, our regulatory environment looks like X, yours looks like Y. What devices do we need to blend these two together? But if the weight of regulation is lower on both sides, it makes this whole task a little bit easier. Do you think that's a too optimistic view, or do you think there's a little hope here?
I think you're right to view it like that. There does seem to be a broad equivalence of attitudes towards regulation and the need to strip it away a bit. I think probably this will come down to politics much more than economics. There are clearly difficulties for a UK government in this space. It's pretty contested territory, and it's difficult for the EU as well in a sort of way that's in some ways different, in some ways the same. I think that if there was a will to do it on both sides, then something could be accomplished along these lines. But I don't know whether there is that coincidence at the political level, although, as you say, at the regulatory level, that probably is the case now.
Right. Well, Douglas, it's been wonderful to chat. And I think for me, the lesson from a conversation like this with someone who's been so close to policymaking for so long is the world is often quite a bit more complicated than it seems, and it also works often quite a bit better than we might presume on first impressions, and I think that's encouraging. Where can we find you? Twitter, LinkedIn?
I'm on LinkedIn, and I'm on Twitter at DA McNeill.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, and thanks for listening.